Hi. In this video, I'll cover a mind mapping 3D summary of Paul Graham's essay, Do Things That Don't Scale. Paul Graham is the founder of Y Combinator, a famous Silicon Valley startup incubator that's funded over 2,000 companies, including Airbnb, Stripe, Dropbox, and many others. And that experience has informed Paul's perspective along with YC's, and Paul's been very generous about writing about those learnings for anybody to really benefit from. And he does that on his website, paulgraham.com. And in the 3D mind map, I've actually got a link to that. So right here in the center, you see this little icon. That's actually a link to his website, paulgraham.com. And here's the essay, Do Things That Don't Scale. As you can see, it's fairly lengthy. And that's because he provides a lot of context to go along with his advice, which is truly beneficial. So if you find some of the ideas shared in this video interesting, I highly recommend reading his full essay. Now, before I get into the specifics about things that don't scale, I want to provide some perspective that's also been extracted from the essay. And I think the first one I'll touch on is a question that YC tends to ask about startups, because I think it's really informative. And that question is, how big could this company get if the founders did the right things? And what are the right things? The right things seem laborious and inconsequential at the time. And so founders are what make startups take off. They're actually more important than the idea. Another important bit of perspective is that initial fragility is normal. Almost all startups are fragile at the beginning, and that the initial reality of products is they're not going to be quite right at first. It's going to take a little while. So this whole process is not necessarily about getting something perfect out of the gate. It's more about learning. He sees perfectionism actually as a form of procrastination. Anything that delays getting your offer in front of customers for feedback is a bad thing. So you should really strive to get that done as early as possible. He also says that you should not be in a scenario or situation where you're dismissing yourself. So the quote there is that the danger is that you'll dismiss your startup yourself. So you definitely want to avoid doing that. Also, on the topic of things to avoid, are a couple that he calls out specifically. One is the big launch. So this idea that one key date with some key press will make all the difference and set the startup down a glide path to success. Well, that's not really the reality. He says getting users will always be a gradual process. The other thing to avoid is this idea that this partnership is going to be the one thing that saves the company. And he finds that rarely are partnerships the big break that founders think they will be. So that perspective, I think, is pretty informative for this whole essay about why doing things that don't scale matters. So let's jump over to that. So the first thing I'll touch on from there is this idea of recruiting users manually. So what he says is that if the market exists, you can usually start by recruiting users manually. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If you're having a two-way dialogue with someone and you still can't get them to give whatever you're offering a shot, then you better reconsider how you're talking about your startup, because it's going to be impossible to do that in a one-way form of communication like advertising. So he says to recruit users, he's got a couple a bit of guidance there. One is, if you're a startup that's solving your own problem, well, all you have to do is find peers similar to you, because they're likely to have the same problem. So that's a great source of initial users that you can manually recruit. The other approach is to focus on users showing early traction. So that's done by doing a comparatively untargeted launch and then seeing which ones of the customers you hit are most enthusiastic about your offer, and find more people like that. So But with recruiting users manually, he says there's some reasons that founders resist. One of them is that the numbers seem small at first, which fails to recognize the power of compound growth. He also says shyness is a reason why startups fail here, and that's just kind of rooted in fear of rejection. And the other one is laziness. Getting out in front of users manually seems hard, so a lot of companies would rather avoid that. So to do this whole process, at least one of the founders in the startup, usually the CEO, will have to spend a lot of time on sales and marketing, and in this case that means getting in front of customers and talking to them. So that is recruiting users manually. I'll go ahead and change the color of that so we know we've covered these topics here. All right, next let's move on to delighting users. That was another pretty big branch of information. So what he says here is that your first users should feel that signing up with you was one of the best choices they ever made. And he's got a Wufoo example in the essay that I highly recommend you check out. But some of the ways to delight users is to really leverage the advantage of being small. So as a small entity, you can provide a level of service that no big company can because they have to operate at scale. That's where they're at. But since you're not there, you can do things that they cannot do, and you should definitely take advantage of that. And that leads right into this point about taking extraordinary measures. You should take extraordinary measures not just to acquire your users, but also to make them happy. And that brings us to his point about an insanely great experience, focusing on quality of execution to a degree that in every day would be considered pathological. And your product could be rough if the experience you give overall for your customer is insanely great. So you can and should give users an insanely great experience with an early incomplete, possibly buggy product if you make up for the difference with attentiveness. So that's the points about delighting users. Now there's 3 reasons why startups come up short here. The first one is that engineers, so this is a bit of a generalization, but engineers tend to undervalue service. That's just not a traditional part of their training. And so that definitely needs to be recognized and addressed if that's the case for your startup. Another one is that startup founders have never experienced the level of service he's talking about themselves. He says their standards for customer service have been set by companies that they've been customers of, which are mostly big ones. So by definition, they can't deliver the kind of service he's talking about. And the last reason is they really never get off the starting blocks because they're worried that these tactics won't scale. And I think what he says here is super insightful. So he says, you'll find that delighting customers scales better than you expected, partly because you can usually find ways to make anything scale more than you would have predicted, and partly because delighting customers will by then have permeated your culture. So when you're at a point that you have to scale, well, you're already geared up to do it the right way. Okay, so that covers the delight users branch. So let's go ahead and mark this one as complete as well. And then we'll move on to a point that's more specific to, let's do this one that is more specific for hardware startups. So this point in the essay says, assemble your initial hardware yourself. And the idea here is that you avoid the big minimum order quantities from overseas manufacturers and ensure your hardware that you do eventually manufacture is right for your customers. So the idea is that by building it yourself, although that's costly on a per unit basis and time consuming, by getting that quickly in front of customers and iterating on it, you'll be in a much better position when it does come time to actually manufacture those. Not only that, but you'll know enough about the hardware that you'll be able to make component decisions if necessary while you're moving to that manufacturing process. So we'll go ahead and mark this one done as well. The next one is a tactic that he calls out, focus deliberately on a narrow market. And so his example there was Facebook and how it initially targeted Harvard students, and it went on to high school, and then it went on to the general market. So the idea there was that you basically got the fire hot with this fast, this group of users that was quick to get, and then that basically fueled the momentum for the rest of the business. And so he says, get a critical mass of users quickly with that focus. And, you know, if you're in a situation where you're trying to decide, should I target the users that I can get fast, or should I target the ones that I think will spend money, you're better off going after the ones that you can get fast, because they're likely early adopters and likely the ones that'll better inform your future product decisions. So next, we'll talk about overly engaging with early users. And he says this is a necessary part of the feedback loop that makes a product good. And so an example he provides here is especially applicable to B2B companies. And what it is a consulting role, but it's not a formal one where you actually get paid for it. So what he says to do here is to pick a single user and basically act as a consultant to that user. And that user basically becomes a mold for which to for that you can develop a profile of, so that you can find more like them. Because if you can solve their problem, you could likely solve that same problem for others like them. And then on that, he also says that as part of that consulting role, you can actually integrate the solution for your customer, so that you can not only solve the customer's problems, but also see what kind of bumps they might hit in that integration process, so you can address those as well. But one thing he really stresses is don't get paid for doing this consulting stuff, because they will expect you to do everything. So you want to avoid making that sort of a formal per hour payment type of contract. Okay, so next, we will move to the final point, which was I've just titled here as manual. But the idea here is it's like the Mechanical Turk idea, where the chess game kind of played you, but really it was a guy underneath the desk. So in this case, you are the software before having the software, or you are the gap filler for the software if it's not quite complete. And what this allows you to do is launch much faster, and by doing this manual process, you'll also know exactly what you need to build to fulfill the customer's needs. So I think that's another really insightful recommendation about doing things that don't scale from Paul Grahm. So that covers the main topics that I basically decomposed out of his essay. Again, I highly recommend checking out his essay if you want the context. He's got a lot of great references to Airbnb and Wufoo and others that I think will really drive a lot of these points home. Again, the link to his essay of Do Things That Don't Scale is in the mind map. I'll actually provide a link to it in the notes below. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me. I'm at dante@scapehop.com. Thanks a lot.